Good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Global China Hub here at the Atlantic Council. On behalf of the Council and on behalf of the University of Notre Dame Keough School of Global Affairs, welcome back to day 2 of our conference on China in the Global South. We have an exciting program ahead today, again, of expertise panels on a range of subjects, as well as conversations with policymakers. But I'm excited that we're kicking off today with a keynote address by Dr. Daniel Twining, the president of the International Republican Institute. Before I introduce Dan, let me note that our audience can submit questions for him at askac.org, askac.org. So let me introduce Dr. Daniel Twining. Dan joined the International Republican Institute as president in 2017, where he leads the Institute's mission to advance democracy and freedom around the world. He heads IRI's team of nearly 1,000 global experts to link citizens and governments, motivate people to engage in the political process, and guide politicians and government officials to be responsive to citizens. IRI works in over 100 countries and is a core institute of the National Endowment for Democracy. Previously, Dr. Twining served as counselor to the president and director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, as a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, as the foreign policy advisor to U.S. Senator John McCain, and as a staff member of the U.S. Trade Representative. He's been an associate of the National Intelligence Council, taught at Georgetown University, and served as a military instructor associated with the Naval Postgraduate School. He serves on the Bush Institute's Advisory Council, the Wilson Center's Asia Advisory Board, and the USAID Administrator's Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid. He testifies regularly before the U.S. Congress on International Affairs, has been a columnist for Foreign Policy at Nikkei, and has served as an advisor to 6 presidential campaigns. Dan, let me welcome you to the podium.
Thanks, Dave. Very happy to be here with all of you, including all of you who are with us remotely. It's a good thing you're remote because we have overflow-only standing room here in Washington. It's great to see everybody. Thank you for coming out. It is a bit daunting to give a talk to a room full and a world full, people tuning in, of actual China experts. So I would just like to maybe make some framing comments just to situate things, I think, in a wider lens. And some of these, I think, are home truths that we perhaps have forgotten in our haste to announce a new rising superpower, or our, I think, perhaps sometimes undisciplined belief in kind of a purely new multipolar world. So let me start by really taking on quite directly the proposition that China possesses some kind of alternative and superior model of development. China, in fact, is following in the footsteps of the Asian tigers, Japan, Korea, Singapore, the city of Hong Kong when it was autonomous. It is pursuing a similar development strategy, except that because of the political rigidities of the Chinese system, China is now stuck at only between 1/3 and 1/4 of those other miracle growth stories per capita GDPs, right? Japan 4 times richer, Korea and Taiwan over 3 times richer, et cetera. Other East Asian economies broke through to high income status only when rapid economic development created large middle classes that demanded political rights and the rule of law to protect their property. That, of course, has not happened in China. The fact is, globally, Dave Schulman used to work at the National Intelligence Council, a lot of long-range forecasting and macro forecasting. The only high-income societies on Earth that do not sit on a bed of oil or gas are open societies with the rule of law. I think we forget this sometimes. There is no modern-day example of successful authoritarian development on par with that of the democracies that produces a high-income society. That does not exist, again, outside of a few micro-states and Gulf petrostates. Economically, we know that democracies actually outperform autocracies for all the messiness and imperfection of democratic systems. The citizens of democracies are on average 6 times richer than the citizens of autocracies. We know, look at the Korean Peninsula, that the driver is not culture or geography, it's politics and institutions, right? Compare South Korea and North Korea. The Atlantic Council's excellent team that produces the Freedom and Prosperity Index reports that 66% of the variation in prosperity around the world can be explained by freedom. Freedom. This makes sense, of course. Property rights, the rule of law, effective and sound institutions, secure capital and investment, promote entrepreneurial aspiration, and generate inclusive growth with minimal corruption. Money follows. The world is not multipolar economically in a way that I think it's sometimes presumed. 70% of the total value of global stock market capitalization, 70% resides in the United States. Democracies produce nearly 3/4 of global GDP. An astounding 86% of portfolio investment globally, so this is financial flows, comes from the United States and US allied countries, with few indicators to suggest that China and its, quote, allies in places like North Korea or Cambodia are going to follow anytime soon. China is also seen in the developing world in particular as the driver of foreign investment, as really the decisive source of capital. In fact, the US and Japan are the world's largest sources of outbound investment. According to the OECD's most recent numbers, the US invests more than twice as much abroad as China does. Combined, the US and Japan invest more than 3 times more abroad than China does. Wealthy Chinese, of course, we know, are more likely to export their savings outside of China, given the risks of one-man rule. Capital flight now exceeds inbound investment. It's worth thinking about this for a second. There's more money leaving China than entering China. For the first time since really Deng Xiaoping opened up the Chinese economy, attesting to the systemic weaknesses of Xi Jinping's model of centralized and politically directed statist rule. Meanwhile, foreign investment in China is plummeting. And I think friends from the global south hoping for some kind of Chinese windfall should look at what's happening to foreign investment into China. According to the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, China's state administration, foreign direct investment in 2023 into China declined 80% from 2022 levels. Those are the Chinese figures. The United States has surpassed China as the world's largest recipient of foreign direct investment. The US, not China. China has, as we know, China has massively exported its industrial overcapacity. We know that debt in China is over 300% of GDP. Heady growth is over in China, I would argue, for reasons related to political stasis and an encroaching totalitarianism. India has become the world's fastest growing major economy. So that's point one. I'm not convinced there is an enduring Chinese miracle that anytime soon will match that of, say, Korea or Taiwan, certainly not Japan. Point two is about the fact that even if we want to accept that we live in a 2-superpower world, superpowers are not created equally, right? We shouldn't take values out of the equation. We should understand, in fact, that the nature of the Chinese system will be the decisive variable in what kind of superpower China is. So I'm very sensitive. We work all over the world. I'm very sensitive with not leading with geopolitics. The work we do is bottom-up democracy support at the International Republican Institute. But I would say that while I think all of us as Americans certainly are concerned with a world that features inclusive growth and democracy and rule of law-based development, responsive governance that answers to citizens, we also do understand the geopolitical implications of a world that is more free and democratic, kind of world Americans would like to see, versus a world that perhaps is modeled on China's vertical of power domestically. So just a foundational point, power works really differently in democracies and autocracies, and their foreign policies out in the world are informed by those distinctions. It's really not simply a domestic equation. In an age of superpowers, the differences in those superpowers' political systems affect everyone, everywhere. At home, the Chinese Communist Party accepts no constraint on its power. This fact is literally written directly into the PRC constitution, so don't take it from me. The weak suffer what they must, with nothing to protect them from the prying eyes or the grasping hands of the state. Chinese Communist Party officials do not worry about press exposés, NGOs, or political opponents exposing their misdeeds. In an environment of such thorough impunity, it isn't shocking that bribery and political violence are as routine for an upwardly mobile CCP official as are persuasion and political horse trading. We should not be surprised, therefore, to see Beijing project this philosophy of power abroad. In the race to grow China's global power through any means necessary, the interests of party central and lower level officials are extremely well aligned. No PRC official trying to expand their personal fiefdom ever need fear being called to account for bribing officials in a country like Ecuador, signing opaque contracts that leave countries like Sri Lanka, Zambia, or Kenya on the hook for ruinous debts, or for trying to turn the Chinese diaspora abroad into a political weapon through threats, violence, and judicious infusions of cash. Quite the contrary. Those officials will probably be promoted beyond accountability by the time anyone realizes anything went wrong. So say what you will about the messiness and the accountability structures in democracies. No mid-level official in really any government in an open society wants to get dragged in front of a legislative oversight committee or see their name on the front page of the morning newspaper. Democracy is not just a government, but a system that puts power in a cage by putting fear into the minds of would-be transgressors. Democratic political institutions are fundamental to preserving countries' sovereignty and freedom of choice, including in their dealings with both the US and China. Okay, point 3, I would like to take on this argument that I hear a lot, that countries should not be forced to choose between the US and China. We work in over 100 countries, as Dr. Schulman pointed out. Most of my colleagues are not American. They are from those countries. So we are very highly attuned at my institute to local realities. Our experience is that it is Chinese Communist Party officials and propaganda that want to frame the question about America somehow making countries choose, pressuring them to make a choice. It may well be true that in some countries, the offices of prime and foreign ministers do not want the US to lobby them on their ties with China, some of which can be corrupting. However, the reality is that on the ground, taking a holistic view, Chinese influence is a hotly contested issue. The line that countries don't want to be forced to choose is denying the intelligence and the agency of people everywhere who are trying to sort through the complex impacts of China on their country. Impacts that are not uniformly positive, irrespective of what Beijing says. People in Ecuador, Sri Lanka, Kenya, and many other countries don't need to look to the South China Sea or the Taiwan Straits for evidence that China is changing the global system. They can see for themselves how China corrupted elites and institutions in their own backyards. The civil society activists and politicians we work with aren't, quote, picking a side in a grand geopolitical struggle. They are putting their countries and communities first because they can see the impact that China is having on their livelihoods and their democracies. So in the International Republican Institute's work, the National Endowment for Democracy's work on China's influence around the world, we do this not because we are, quote, anti-China, because our partners tell us how China is impacting them by corrupting politicians, intimidating journalists, and swaying elections. Our interest, and I would say the US interest, is in countries exercising democratic sovereignty. Decision-making should be vested in citizens, not in some distant foreign capital. Similarly, leaders in developing societies and in developed societies should, of course, be responsive to their citizens, not to foreign interests that advance an agenda through forms of coercion, corruption, and co-optation that is corrosive of democracy. Our interest, I would say also, all of us, since all of us come from countries that are smaller than China, except Indians, our interest is in a world that is safe for small countries. And of course, we still remember fondly when Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi in 2010 told an ASEAN meeting, China's a big country and other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact. That's the kind of might make right world that the Chinese Communist Party envisions. Okay. Next point, we are leaving opportunities on the table. I've sort of assessed part of the problem, which doesn't mean that we are operationalizing solutions effectively. The reality of China's impact cries out for additional involvement with and support from other democracies for our partners in the Global South. We know that there are many people who want to work on this issue, from academia to journalism to politics to civil society. People all over the world are hungry for and interested in China and knowledge about it. And they want the resources to build healthy, equitable relationships between China and their country. Yet all over the world, we see enormous gaps in understandings of how the Chinese Communist Party actually operates and what its objectives are. We see journalists hesitant to tackle a Chinese corruption-related story because of complex corporate structures and massive, opaque party-state bureaucracy layered on top of an unfamiliar culture and language. And we see politicians who want to put forward sensible, well-grounded solutions, but lack the time and staff to figure out what has worked elsewhere. We also see people all over the world who want to work together and self-empower to build democratic resiliency, to protect their country's sovereignty, and to enjoy healthy and equitable partnerships with China. I think there's a big role, including for groups like this, in helping to build a global network of activists and experts who can help our countries navigate the complexities of dealing with a rising Chinese superpower. So, despite the wealth of opportunities for engagement that I see for all of us who are like-minded, many big countries, including many American allies, are actually quite hesitant to engage in this out of fear of being perceived as, quote, picking a side, being, quote, too pro-American, or, quote, having a Cold War mindset. These are things that you hear from the podium of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, by the way. When working with the Global South, these countries' approach to China is often overly technocratic or tentative. So people will talk about, quote, governance, development, and institutional capacity without talking about democracy, despite a growing body of evidence showing democracy actually advances governance, development, and institutional capacity, that Beijing's quest to export the, quote, wisdom of its system does not. I think more countries need to get in the game, not just because partners around the world want help and support to do meaningful work on China, but because the future of democracy is at stake. And I would say this is especially true of India, a country where I've lived and worked and visit frequently. India's aspiration is to lead the Global South and not cede that space to China. India's foreign minister calls India a non-Western power, but not an anti-Western power, which of course is an important distinction. India is rising as the decisive member of the Global South in partnership with key Western powers that are supporting its rise. This is, frankly, a superior approach that India is pursuing compared to China's effort to promote an anti-Western and anti-freedom form of development that privileges economic growth partnered with political authoritarianism. And we really do just need to remind ourselves again of the casualties of China's development model, including inside China. Millions of Uyghurs in camps, the end of an autonomous Hong Kong governed by rule of law and effective institutions, that we can see the price inside China. We don't want to see that globalized around the world, including through the export of Chinese surveillance capacity and other technologies. I have a lot more to say, particularly about Latin America and Africa, but Dave, I know we want to have a little chat, so I'm just going to park some more specific comments, though I do think it's important to maybe focus in rather than staying macro. It is important, obviously, to talk about these issues not simply at the 100,000-foot level, but how they relate to, for instance, debt traps in countries like Zambia, where China was a decisive election issue because of the corruption and indebtedness it fostered. In Latin America, where frankly there is not deep knowledge of China's grand strategy and ambitions, a belief that business with China is just business, with the result that China has decisive stakes in countries' telecoms and communications and energy infrastructures. So let me just wrap up with a few, again, macro thoughts. Just because dictators have been able to maintain power through repression does not mean their people don't want a voice and a vote. And I would argue that's true even inside China, of course. No one should underestimate the power of freedom's appeal. Even dictators nod to this unique power of legitimacy. Therefore, Vladimir Putin will be holding presidential, quote, elections quite soon. Xi Jinping claims to run a, quote, Chinese-style democracy. There is no other source of legitimacy on earth except popular consent, which is why even the world's great autocrats invoke democratic norms to justify their one-man, one-party rule. This is not, of course, to understate the enormous threats facing us very directly in this world today, perhaps the most dangerous world since the 1930s. Authoritarian aggression is on the march, from Putin's invasion of Ukraine to Iran's attempt to reorder the Middle East through its violent proxies to China's menacing threats against Taiwan. Autocrats are also playing offense by deploying economic coercion and sophisticated campaigns of political interference against free societies. The democratic model, however, has repeatedly demonstrated its superiority to authoritarianism, including, as I started with, just in terms of basic human development outcomes. But there's also just a structural reality. Without free elections that reflect the genuine priorities of citizens, political competition to generate fresh approaches to policy challenges, and the free exchange of information to provide leaders with the information they need to make effective decisions, authoritarian governments inevitably do become sclerotic, insulated from reality, and fundamentally unable to deliver for their citizens. We're seeing forms of this in China, in Russia, in Iran, and elsewhere. These regimes are actually far more vulnerable to economic, social, and political instability. They are not sources of instability. They themselves are fundamentally unstable. They also are much more inclined to make catastrophic strategic mistakes, like Putin's belief that Ukraine would fall without a fight. So, final thought, those who argue that Americans don't care about foreign policy, and this sounds like a pretty wonky conversation, but it's not germane to where we are as a nation, I think should actually consider the lessons of history, right? American presidents actually do suffer when they are viewed as abdicating our international leadership responsibilities, even though it's fine to have a very lively debate about what those responsibilities entail. I could go through many examples, but look at how President Biden actually went underwater in the polls when he abandoned Afghanistan and has literally never recovered. Foreign policy is a factor in the success of our political leaders. Polling by the Reagan Institute, where I am part of its strategy group, shows that a clear majority of Americans, on a scale of 1 to 10, the average polling in the US comes out at 7.5, want the US to maintain international leadership rather than ceding it to our adversaries. So that's about 75% of Americans. While also about 3 in 4 Americans, according to the polling, believe that we should, whenever possible, stand up for democracy and human rights. I think this is a comparative advantage for the United States. We can engage with the global South in a qualitatively different way. We're never going to do it perfectly. We're always going to be behind and not have enough resources to bring to bear. But there is a qualitative difference in the way that the US wants to help countries pursue inclusive development and prosperity, democratic development that delivers for all citizens. I think that is the United States' most important calling card, and we should use it in the global South and the developing world, again, given the success of the democratic development model. Thank you all.
Would you join us over here? Thank you, Dan. That was compelling and insightful as always. Great comments, and I really appreciated you bringing in some of the work that the International Republican Institute is doing and what you've been seeing on the ground in your, 5, almost 6 years leading
7 years.
Almost 7?
Getting
Okay.
old, Dave.
Wow. So I have a bunch of questions I could ask, but we only have about 5 minutes, and we do have some decent questions here from the audience, so thank you for those who put those in. And one of the ones I wanted to ask relates to a point you were making about the general failings, arguably, of authoritarian systems for delivering for their people, right? And this argument about freedom and prosperity and how they're linked. And so the question we have here is, we've long believed in the high correlation between freedom and prosperity, but after the brutal crackdown in Hong Kong, international businesses, including American multinational corporations, had few qualms. Hong Kong and China's economies were going strong in 2020 before COVID, which really is what kicked off the demise. So the question here, I think, is could Beijing have continued to pull off the kind of record growth and continued success and prosperity that we were seeing earlier Is it the fault of the authoritarian system? Is there something inherent in authoritarian systems, not just China's but others, that kind of eventually lead to the kind of economic malaise that we're seeing now in China?
So Hong Kong is an interesting case study because the average Hong Konger was something like 5 times richer than the average Chinese. It really was the golden goose. The Hong Kong democracy protests peaked in 2019 before the pandemic. So I appreciate the mention of the pandemic, but the pandemic is not what killed Hong Kong. What killed Hong Kong was a CCP crackdown, an attempt to revoke Hong Kong's economy that brought as many as 2 million Hong Kongers, a quarter of the population of the city, into the streets, protesting for political freedom and the rule of law, which was crushed. The national security law, the gross interference in what had been democratic elections in that city. Hong Kong no longer is autonomous. Capital has fled Hong Kong. And it's really disappointing because, like Taiwan, it was just a vision of a very different Chinese future. I think the Chinese Communist Party leadership in Beijing understood very clearly that if all of China became like Hong Kong, Xi Jinping and company would no longer be in power, ultimately. The Chinese Communist Party would not actually succeed. So they acted preemptively to prevent what was happening in Hong Kong from essentially going viral more broadly across China. But again, Hong Kong's development model had spoken for itself, and it's a shame because the Xi Jinping development model is not going to produce what Hong Kongers accomplished in terms of prosperity.
Right. A related question that we've talked about a little bit in our panels yesterday about China's slowing economy and whether that changes the nature of its influence and engagement across the developing world, because we always think of China as leading with its economic influence, and China thinks of its comprehensive national power and puts the economy at the heart of it. So the question here is, given the increasing trend, and you mentioned this, of global South countries looking more to the United States and its allies for foreign direct investment, how do you view China's role in the global system? Is that going to fundamentally, this shift we're now seeing in terms of away from China necessarily as the kind of investor of choice for developing countries?
I think yes. So the Chinese offer is different than it was 5 or 6 years ago when the Belt and Road investments were vast and China was growing much more robustly and leaning forward. The Chinese offer seems to have changed. You know, the global civilization dialogue and some of these other more recent pronunciations, the pullback of Belt and Road, the precipitous drop in Chinese direct investment in many countries. I mean, I didn't get into it here, but Dave, there's an impressive number on Africa that Chinese investment in Africa was down from 20 billion to less than 1 billion in 2022 at a 20-year low. Yeah. I mean, that's not declined by 10 or 20%. That's declined by 90% in Chinese foreign outflows of capital. So the Chinese offer is changing. I think that's partly because of China's development struggles at home, the new statism, but also the fact that a lot of these projects didn't produce or produced backlash. So let's see. I do think it's important for us to concede that China takes the global South very seriously, so seriously that they deploy extensive influence operations, propaganda, diplomacy to try to energize and rally countries in the developing world against the United States. Now, we should remember they are not trying to energize and rally countries in the developing world towards some amazing development outcome. They are essentially, they themselves are using Cold War mentality to try to turn countries, including in like Central America and Latin America in our own hemisphere, against the United States. That is their ultimate strategy. And I think our friends in the developing world are smart enough to understand what's going on.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think and this came up in some of our conversations yesterday, which is that even though we have China kind of perhaps not being able to leverage quite so much their economic engagement and influence in countries, they are going to potentially now lean even harder into some of those other methods to ensure a level of influence politically and otherwise in some of these countries, whether it's through information operations, through cultivating elites, these kinds of other means by which the party has tried to achieve its ends, right? We have time for maybe one more question, and you are both as an academic and also just in your kind of as a practitioner and a policymaker, you have looked a lot at the role of allies, right, in the U.S. attempt to achieve our goals around the world, particularly looking at India, as you mentioned in your remarks, and Japan as well. So we have a question here that's kind of more specific to how do you view India as a democratic alternative, as a leader of the global South, given what's been happening in India. But I want to broaden that out a little bit as well to talk about, and we'll be discussing this today in our Asia panel and then with our policymakers later in the day. How important is it for the United States to be working with India, with Japan, and then of course with Europeans and others to be achieving these aims and giving alternatives to countries in the global South to what China's offering?
Thank you. It's a great question. It's super important. I mean, one is obviously our development cooperation with both Europe and Japan, and now Korea, which is leaning far forward, including on democracy assistance abroad, that we really need to step that up. And I think our friends in the administration understand that. We're all trying to work to operationalize that the West writ large has a big mission together to accomplish, including in the global South. But India, I think, is quite singular because it is a non-Western but not anti-Western country.
Yes. Because
it now is experiencing its own essentially development miracle under Modi, but set in motion by previous Congress-led governments. So this is a bipartisan affair because it is doing extraordinary things that are inclusive and empowering for the bottom billion, basically, through the digital stack and digital welfare payments, uplifting of women in rural villages through new technologies, that sort of thing. So there's a particular role for India, which itself is a development donor, I think, to play in coordination with us, but also on its own in showing countries in Africa, for instance, that there are alternative models to totalitarianism that produce broad-based prosperity and technological progress. I think we all have a lot at stake in India's success. India's genius, and I think part of what will propel its rise, is its democratic system. Its inclusive, pluralistic democratic system, which makes it non-threatening to countries in the developing world in ways that China is not, in ways that China actually is corrosive of sovereignty. So India needs to protect those democratic institutions and that democratic culture because that is part of what will propel it strategically in terms of the influence it seeks on the global stage.
Well, that is a fantastic way to end our conversation and to lead into our next panel on Asia. Great. Thank you, Dan, so much for kicking us off with such fantastic remarks and conversation here.
Thank you, Dave. Good to be with you all.
Thank you. We will take a brief moment, but please do remain in your seats as we transition to our next panel on Asia.